morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. Some of you I haven't seen in a while, so I'm really glad to see everyone here. And I look forward to sharing my dissertation research with all of you. It's a project that I'm very passionate about and that I think has a great potential to have impact. So I have some handouts because it was a struggle to try and fit everything in the presentation. So if everybody can grab a handout. On the first page, you have the agenda, and on the second and third pages, you have some key definitions. And on the last pages, you have some quotes that I'll be referring to when I get to the final part of the presentation. So maybe before we start, we can go around the room and introduce ourselves. So I'm Alvine, most of you, I think everyone here knows me. I'm a PhD candidate in the Public Policy Department, and I'm going to be presenting about my research. Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Francine Menasci. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education in the Leadership and Education Department, and I'm the co-chair on this dissertation committee.
I'm Michael Johnson. I'm an associate professor here in public policy and public affairs, and I'm co-chairing with Francine.
Hi, I'm Mark Warren. I think everybody knows me. I'm a faculty member in the public policy program.
Hello, I'm Gerardo Blanco. I'm an assistant professor in the higher education program here on campus and very happy to serve as a member of Alvine's committee.
I'm Sandeep Johnny. I'm a fourth year doctoral student in the public policy department.
Hi, I'm Alessandra Basso Vanderich, and I'm a doctoral student in the sociology department.
I'm Rose Nyawando, doctoral student, public policy program at here.
I'm Xin-Ching Wu. I'm also a doctoral student in the public policy program.
I'm Hyun-Jung Lee, first year PhD student in public policy.
Good. Thanks to all of you for being here. My title, as you can see, is Addressing Employability of University Graduates in Sub-Saharan Africa, a case study of Cameroon. And when I started the PhD program, I think my number one goal really was to use the acquired knowledge and skills that I would be learning in the program to contribute to policymaking in the African context. And obviously, I was naturally drawn to Cameroon because that's where I'm from. And I came to be interested in higher education specifically through conversations with my dad, who often talked about how university was back in these days and compared to how it is today. And so in the second year of the PhD program, I started researching how higher education can impact socioeconomic development in the African context, and that's when I became more familiar with all the host of other challenges that we have in African higher education systems. And while talking to some of my friends who remain to study in Cameroon, I realized that many of them would pile degree after degree, but they weren't getting jobs. And so I looked into unemployment statistics of a lot of African countries, and I was really shocked. And this is what leads me to this puzzle. So the main puzzle of this whole research program is that I was wondering, why are so many university graduates unemployed in Cameroon, specifically because it's the focus of this dissertation, but more generally in Africa, and how can we begin to solve this? So according to projections by consulting firms and the World Bank, about 12 million young people are expected to enter the labor market on the African continent each year. And by 2050, the continent will have the largest supply of workforce in the world, even ahead of China and India. So the overarching research question for my study is, why is there a gap between academic offerings and the labor market needs for socioeconomic development in Cameroon, and how can this issue be addressed? So the purpose of the study is to improve understanding of the graduate unemployment challenge and explore solutions for increased employability of university graduates through the case study of Cameroon. So research has established a positive relationship between higher education and economic development in Africa. However, so in theory, high levels of education should have benefits for the individual as well as for society as a whole. However, in many African countries, the higher level of education you have, the less opportunities you actually have in the labor market. So basically, someone who is in some African countries, someone who's a university graduate is more likely to be unemployed than someone who's a high school graduate. So this is how I got to this puzzle, and given the demographic trends that I just mentioned, this issue is a cause for concern for many and has even been referred to as a ticking time bomb. And some of the literature has identified the mismatch of skills as a main contributing factor for unemployment of graduates. But most of these studies have been conducted in Anglophone countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Uganda, and Ghana. So my study is focusing on Cameroon, which is Anglophone and Francophone, and it specifically aims to add to the literature on employability of African graduates. So although I take an inductive approach in this study, 3 theoretical lenses help inform my study. First, I conceptualized employability as the ability to get productive employment within a year of completing a university degree. There are various dimensions of employability, including the person's individual attributes as well as competencies that the person acquires through all kinds of training and learning. But the most widely cited and used operationalization of employability is the one by Harvey, which is summarized as the propensity to get a job within 6 months of graduating. But in the Cameroonian context, I kind of extended it to 1 year because of the difficult context. And the capabilities approach, which I'm sure a lot of you know, is a human development paradigm, which focuses on what people are actually able to do and be. And I thought that this was an interesting lenses to use in my study because in order to go beyond employability and kind of explore how the students' university experiences contribute to the well-being beyond being able to get a job. And then finally, post-colonial legacy refers to this strand of literature which studies the impacts that colonial traditions have had on the former colonies. And Cameroon has a dual colonial heritage. It has been, part of Cameroon has been colonized by Britain and part of it has been colonized by France. So there are 2 traditions essentially of administration that still remain in Cameroon till today, and I was interested in how those play out in the education system, specifically at the tertiary level, which since that's what I'm focusing on. So I focus on Cameroon, as I said earlier, because I have a personal connection as a native of the country, but also because of the relatively safe access to the field at the time I was doing my field work, and as well as this opportunity to explore the post-colonial legacy aspect of education that I just mentioned. And to give you some context, these are some basic indicators about Cameroon. We have a 22.8 million population, about 80% Francophone, about 20% Anglophone, and that's kind of a similar breakdown as well in terms of regions, like regions where the language is spoken, as well as the amount of people who actually speak those languages. And then 32 billion US dollar GDP, 350 GDP per capita, and 37.5 people who live below the national poverty line as determined by the country. In terms of economic activity, even though agriculture is the sector that provides the most employment in Cameroon, the services sector is the sector that provides most opportunity for growth and productivity. As you can see here, it has the highest level of value added to the GDP. And in terms of employment, 90% of Cameroonians are employed in the informal labor market, and 10% are employed in the formal labor market. And of those who are employed in the formal labor market, 80% work in the private sector and 20% in the public sector. So essentially the private sector is the largest supplier of employment in the current context, whereas years ago, few decades, like I would say maybe the first 2 decades after independence, it was mostly the government that was the main employer. So it's a very different context that is operating in today. And according to national statistics, current unemployment is at 15%, but this is the definition of employment that you have here on the handout. It's the one established by the International Labour Organization, and actually more accurate, a more accurate representation of that is the underemployment, which is at 70%. And based on a survey conducted by the Ministry of Higher Education in 2014, it takes about 3 years for a first-time university graduate to secure employment after receiving his or her degree. So Cameroon has 8 public universities: University of Yaoundé 1, Yaoundé 2, Douala, Cham, Maroua, Bamenda, and Boya. Boya and Yaoundé. The ones that are in bold are the ones that are included that are represented in the study. And then the ones where I put Anglophone, those are the 2 Anglophone universities. And until the late 90s and 2000s, the government was actually the sole provider of post-secondary education. But now now that the government has liberalized the sector, the amount of private institutions has grown from 0 to about 160, and this is only for the ones that are recognized, because there are actually a whole lot more institutions that are running, but they're not necessarily recognized by the state. But however, public higher education absorbs about 85% of the student body in Cameroon, which is the primary reason I focused my study on public university graduates. So my research design is a qualitative study using policy documents, semi-structured interviews, and focus groups. With the interviews, I interviewed 4 categories of respondents: employed graduates, unemployed graduates, employers, and the faculty, administrators, and policymakers. And the faculty, administrator, and policymakers is one category because a lot of them actually have more than one hat. That's why I kind of lumped it into this one category. And then I conducted 80 interviews and 4 focus groups, and consulted 9 policy documents, which I obtained through the field work when I was able to interview some of the administrators in the Ministry for Higher Education. In fact, some of the most valuable pieces of information that I was able to get is through those policy documents that are not publicly available, that I was able to get from the Ministry of Higher Education when I went for my fieldwork. So my main methods of recruitment were criterion sampling, meaning that the participant had to meet a certain amount of requirements before I could interview them. And then snowball sampling, meaning that I've initially used my network to identify study participants, and then eventually I recruited more participants through the first ones that I interviewed. My analytical process followed the Miles and Huberman framework, and at the data collection stage, I wrote memos throughout the data collection process, and it's mainly notes from those memos that I used to develop my initial codebook. Out of the 80 interviews that I conducted, 68 of them were audio tape and transcribed verbatim, and all the focus groups as well were transcribed verbatim. Some were in English and some were in French, but all the analysis happened in French. All the analysis happened in English. And I used the software called the Deuce. It's for those of you who know NVivo, it's pretty much the similar tagging system. And at the conclusion and verification stage, what I did in order to kind of vet the way I was analyzing my data is I shared portions of my analysis with some of the study participants. So it's a pretty large data set, and so the things that emerge from the data, it's way more than I could discuss here, and even way more than I could even discuss in my dissertation. But for the presentation, I selected some key themes that I connect to the quotes that you have on page 4 of the handout. So 2 important themes were the poor quality of the training in public universities, as well as the marginalization of vocational education. And these are illustrated in the quotes 1 and 2. In the first quote, an HR manager in the banking industry says, "You see, you have people coming out of university who are unable to build houses. They cannot do that. They're not able to go to the farm to develop effective food crops, exports. These are things that are missing in the country. What exactly are we training students to do when we have so many unmet needs?" And then the other one says, "There's a real disconnect between the training offered in Cameroonian universities and the needs of the labor market. Students are victims of an outdated system. They're studying marketing in Douala, but they have never been to a terrain de vente. And terrain de vente, it's kind of like an open market, which is a very common thing in Cameroon. And so they don't learn how to create. Therefore, they're not able to accomplish tasks assigned to them properly, and they're not able to build their own businesses because they have not learned how to cope with problems, how to meet needs." So many employers confirmed the skill mismatch that was identified in previous studies, and they believe that this made the recruitment process extremely challenging, and in some cases, employers actually explicitly said that they stay away from public university graduates, and they have a preference for certain specific private universities. There are a lot of names that came up, private universities' name that came up in employees' interviews, as well as in some cases they even have a preference for people who are trained abroad. And beyond the technical skills, employers also found that graduates often lack in soft skills such as communication or teamwork. And when I was conducting the focus groups, I also realized that the culture of group presentations or things like that, it was non-existent in a lot of the Cameroonian public universities whose students I talked to. And connected to those 2 themes was the disconnection between the working world and academic offerings. And in quote 4, this unemployed graduate says, "I've been looking for a job for a while now, but of course I have to survive in the meantime. As far as I'm concerned, doing a series of menial jobs is not working. A lot of people try to get involved in small activities to make a living while looking for an internship or a full-time job. Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of people who would like to be employed, but they cannot find a job, and in the formal sector, it is what you meant. The reason is there's a disconnection between us and the professional world. This sentiment was echoed by many other participants, especially in the focus groups. Many students are actually starting to wonder, why am I going to university? Why am I doing this? And even with students who had positive university experiences, because there were a lot of participants in my study, despite all the challenges that believed that they had a positive university experience. But even with those, yeah, so even with students who had positive experiences, they still found that they still tended to find that they were not well prepared for the job market. And another interesting theme for me, and I think for the students who participated in the study, was this thing I call the information asymmetry about the job search process, and it's illustrated in quote 3. People are not very connected with job search websites. I mean, a few people might know about them, but I think the majority do not, and that's a problem. I found that graduates lacked the knowledge about key elements of job hunting, such as networking, job search tools, and oftentimes people who didn't have connections would have this cookie cutter approach to job search, which is CV dropping at major well-known companies, and that's it. That was pretty much their only approach, and it was very common. It was very common in either students that I talked to in the focus groups when they were looking for internships. Similar process. The employed graduates that I interviewed. It was across the board. It was very common. And then finally, I found a discrepancy in expectations for the role of higher education across the different stakeholders. It seemed that employers and students viewed education as an opportunity to acquire skills and competencies that would allow them to be productive. In other words, get a job within a reasonable timeline after graduation, while some higher education administrators actually believe that the main purpose of universities was just to impart knowledge to the students. And that's evident in quote 4, where one of the administrators says, first of all, I don't think that university should have anything to do with employability. Our job is not to provide employment to our students, but to provide them with training. We take care of the training part. The employment part is not our responsibility. It's up to the learners to make the best use of their knowledge. Even if we wanted to help, we do not have the means to do so. So there's no culture of institutional research in Cameroonian public universities, and it doesn't even seem to be a priority. And I found this quite problematic because it means that 85% of the student body will be disillusioned after graduation, because most people who go to university in Cameroon go to public universities. And in my mind, nobody goes to study computer science to then go and sell cookies, for example. So there's really this disconnect between what the students expect from the education that they're getting and what the administrators, the people in charge of designing and implementing these academic programs have in mind for the education. So then this diagram I conceived based on the literature and findings from the interviews. it's by no means an exhaustive diagram, but I think it captures the essence of the options that graduates have when they're done with their studies. So essentially, you have three options. When you graduate from a public university in Cameroon, you have three options. You're either going to be self-employed or in a salary position in the informal sector. You're either going to be unemployed, which is at the bottom, or you're going to be employed in the formal sector, which is to the right. What most graduates are actually looking for are jobs in this right side, right? But these barriers, the lack of connection, lack of work experience, lack of practical skills, the preference for government jobs, because that's another thing. I didn't necessarily go too deep into that, but that was another important thing, the preference for government jobs when, as I showed you earlier, 80% of jobs are in the private sector and 20% are in the public sector, but yet there's this strong preference for government jobs. And then the limited knowledge that the students have of the job search tools. So these are the barriers to access that I identified for formal employment for the university graduates. But most of them, based on the statistics, most of them actually end up to the left because access to the informal sector is pretty easy, low cost, but the problem with that as well is that it has low wages and no job security. And a lot of Cameroonian policymakers have tried to kind of romanticize this informal sector as something that at least gives a means of subsistence to people that shouldn't be neglected, and it shouldn't. But I think the focus of my dissertation really is on this right side. How do we provide more formal employment to people who invest time and resources? Because a lot of families actually save up to send people to university in Cameroon, so they expect that it's going to be productive. So then this vignette is it's to exemplify a little bit the pathways, even though graduates who have the kinds of technical skills that employers, sometimes graduates who even have the technical skills that employers are looking for also find themselves in the unemployed category. So there are many kinds of unemployed university graduates, but what this slide exemplifies is a typical pathway of an employed graduate in the sample of students that I interviewed. So William is a 30-year-old male who is originally from the central region of Cameroon. He grew up in the West and he graduated from high school in 2005. He enrolled at the University of Chang to study accounting. When he graduated with his bachelor's in 2008, because in Cameroon it's 3 years, as opposed to 4 years, the way it is here. So when he graduated with his bachelor's in 2008, he started looking for work. He had never done an internship or attended a career fair in his life. And while looking for work, he started helping at his uncle's mobile phone shop in Douala to make a living. And 2 years and more than 100 CVs later, he finally secured an internship in a well-known oil and gas company. But that wasn't connected to any of the things that he had done. It was actually connected to a family connection. That's how he was actually able to get that internship. And while at this internship, he started building his network. And when the internship ended, he decided to enroll in a private university MBA program with savings from his internship. And when he completed this program, it took him about 6 months to secure a full-time salary position in a company in the energy sector. So again, William's story is that of many other graduates, but it's not the only story. There are many things that impact the graduate employability, as I discussed earlier in the themes. But this gives you a sense of the kind of pathway to employment that is the norm for hundreds of thousands of other young Cameroonians and perhaps even in other African countries. So this other diagram that I have, pathways to formal employment, essentially focuses on that right part of the first diagram. And because I focus on formal employment, the purpose of this graphic is to display the different types of interactions that need to happen among the different stakeholders in order to improve the supply of formal employment as well as the qualified human resources to fill those jobs. I can't go into too many details on this graph, but in summary, what I'm trying to convey is that policymakers need to provide a more enabling environment for job creation, as well as improved administration and infrastructures in the higher education system. You will note that I didn't include the informal sector in this framework, but that's again because the focus of the dissertation is on how to improve formal employment. The informal sector is a whole other issue that needs to be dealt with, but it's not the focus of the study. So in terms of the comparative perspective, I found that broadly the Anglophone system was perceived to be better performing than the Francophone system because of its rigor and integration of practice in their curriculums. And what this means is that, for example, journalism graduate from the University of Boya, which is the Anglophone study that was included in my study, the Anglophone university that was included in my study. A journalism graduate from the University of Boya is more likely to have it's more likely to know how to use a microphone because they've been exposed to it, or he's more likely to have had a segment on a radio show because the university has a campus radio, things like that. But this wouldn't necessarily be the case for a graduate from the University of Douala, for example, which is one of the Francophone universities in the sample. And although Cameroonian universities have faced the same structural challenges as Francophone universities, there seems to be a more wholesome approach to the training, having the theoretical knowledge as well as the practical knowledge, which was not necessarily the case in the Francophone universities. And the main explanation for that was that these universities attempt, notwithstanding all the limited financial resources, to include the practical side of the learning for their students. So, obsolescence of the current higher education system and the tightness of the formal employment labor market, but also at the individual level, there are some behavioral predispositions that the graduates have when they go onto the job market. For example, that a participant I mentioned who would only drop CV, the only approach to looking for a job is dropping CVs around, and they don't really have a knowledge of the job search process. So there are all those different things that contribute to unemployment of the graduates in Cameroon. And as a side note, in February 2016, there was a fund that was actually created it was created and launched by the Cameroonian president to tackle this youth unemployment issue, because, and I'm saying youth unemployment issue, I'm not trying to throw you off, but it's basically the larger problem of this specific piece I'm looking at in my dissertation, which is graduate unemployment. But generally, youth there's a big youth unemployment challenge all over the African continent. And university graduates, of course, they fall within that category. Category that's characterized as youth. And so the Cameroonian government started this fund in February 2016. It's 102 billion CFA francs. That's about 175 million USD. That is supposed to be dedicated to this issue. So I'm hoping that some of these recommendations might actually get traction in this policy circle. And the way I designed these recommendations is to match the current time frame provided by the government strategic policy document called Vision 2035. It's a strategy established by the Cameroonian government to become an emerging country by 2035. And I can come back to this slide for more details during the Q&A, but the overriding idea is that the overriding idea in the recommendations is to connect the long-term vision for socioeconomic development with strategic planning in the higher education sector. And so I believe that this will help solve the problem of graduate unemployment. Some of the recommendations have been proposed in former studies, for example, the entrepreneurship piece and the partnership with employers piece. But some of the things that are proposed I have not seen before. For example, the government-sponsored experiential program in the second part, the last one. It's something that I think can help build capacity and allow graduates to solve real socioeconomic challenges that we have, because we have no shortage of those, I can assure you. So they will be able to build capacity while honing on the skills that they have acquired through their education. So that's the overriding theme in my recommendation, connecting the long-term vision for socioeconomic development with the higher education system, essentially. And a few suggestions for future research. I wasn't able to talk to as many unemployed graduates as I had hoped to, so I think it will be important to have to extend. One way to extend this study would be to have one study that only looks at unemployed university graduates and really understand their experiences. I'm sure they're very different. There are many different nuances to those experiences, and connected to that, the experience as well of university graduates who become self-employed. In the current setup, many of them probably do become self-employed, but in the informal sector. But what do we know about the ones who actually get self-employed in the formal sector? How does that happen, and how can that be supported? A better understanding of what motivates the students to study what they study. Because one thing that I did find as well in my study is that I think the way our education system is set up more or less imposes certain choices on the students. So it'll be important to know how the students make those choices, and whether there's something that can be done to kind of steer students in the right direction without necessarily imposing them what to study. And then finally, another interesting extension of the study would be to look at how the dual language legacy has impacted the education system in Canada, in contrast with the Cameroonian experience, because in Canada they also have English and French, and trying to contrast those experiences. And that's pretty much all I have. This research wouldn't have been possible without actually everyone in this room, most people here. But I'd like to verbally acknowledge my committee, Michael, Francine, Mark, Gerardo, and as well graduate studies and the Office of International Programs because I was able to get two research grants from those two offices that really considerably shortened the time that I would have spent at the dissertation stage. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for everyone who's here, and I'm looking forward to answering questions.
Okay. To pose some questions, and we usually start with the external member first, and then we end with the chair or co-chairs. And then after that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So, Harvey, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, first of all, congratulations for getting to this point. And research projects are complex, and certainly there were many different factors in yours that I'm sure complicated data collection, analysis, and so on. And I really want to commend you, first of all, for your ambition in a project like this. When I was looking at the slide with your findings, I realized that each of these themes could have been a dissertation in its own right. So what I would like to do is maybe to just focus on one, and if there's time, maybe a second one. But one of your findings has to do with this discrepancy in expectations, right, for the role of higher education in Cameroon. And I think as a higher education scholar, I am very intrigued by how your study informs that particular question. Especially, I think you do a very good job illustrating these different expectations. And particularly, I was very intrigued by the faculty members and the administrators who suggested that it's not within their responsibilities to do anything about employability. Right? So I'm really interested with that in context, right? And thinking about your policy recommendations, what do you think can be done to address these, what seem to me, very deeply seated assumptions about what the role is?
Are we doing a round of questions before
You can answer the questions one at a time.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that a lot of this has to do with political will. One piece of explanation, I would say, is this idea that I read in an author called Asiye Lumumba. She talks about the dependency trap, and she also talks about how higher education at some point was seen as a threat by a lot of African politicians, because usually the opposition would come from universities. So I think that has contributed to those kinds of views, and in order for those deep-seated beliefs to change, I guess, it will have to take a lot of political will to really provide effective autonomy to the institutions of higher education. Because another thing that, as I said, there are so many things that I learned in this dissertation. One thing that wasn't in my presentation is that the way that the accounting system is set up in Cameroonian University, everything has to go through the Ministry of Higher Education. Every single thing. So this discourages a lot of institutions to seek external funding beyond what they're getting from the states, and also limits then what they could do, even if they want to do it, they might not have the resources or the motivation to go out and get those resources when they know that it's going to end up being tied by whatever conditions the Ministry of Higher Education wants.
So thank you for that response, and I would say as you continue to grapple with these questions, it would be important that maybe in your recommendations you incorporate some elements about what to do with these assumptions, because change in higher education, as you know, is very difficult. And maybe identifying some of those potential avenues to influence what happens within universities. I think the other aspect that was also very intriguing to me was sort of this job-seeking behavior among graduates that you identified, both employed and unemployed. And it really, the vignette, by the way, I think was very effective in sort of capturing the complexity of your study. But I was very intrigued, right, by, some of the language that is used there is, this particular graduate sent all the CVs, all of that work happened, and yet his internship had nothing to do with that. It was sort of through connections. And then what happened afterwards really points to something else that you mentioned, which is the reputation that private universities have. So, I mean, I think this really could have implications for sort of like career preparation and career education. So I wonder about your thoughts on that topic. Sort of what are some potential interventions, what can be done about these behaviors?
Yeah, so the potential interventions are some of the first things that I have in the recommendations. Mm-hmm. This first part, partnerships with employers, steering some of the students more towards entrepreneurship, as obviously the formal employment market is very tight. And monitoring and evaluation is this piece about the complete lack of institutional research. You would be hard pressed to find graduation rates. I mean, graduation rates is even too far. Even just basic numbers about how many students are, what percentage of students are studying in social sciences, what percentage are studying in medicine, and even where they exist, they're very closely guarded by the government. So I think one policy avenue would be to really make that aspect of higher education more transparent and really put in more resources in understanding. And even if we want to say that it's not our job to make students employable, but isn't it at least our job to understand who our students are, what they're doing, where they're going, just in general. So I think that would be one policy avenue, definitely making that aspect of higher education more transparent and putting more resources, making it more of a priority. Because in every Cameroonian university, there's a department called, what's the name? Something to the effect of university evaluation, something to the effect of that. But in theory, it's there. It's like this one person, but in practice, you wouldn't find any data anywhere. Or even if it exists, it's not available for the public to use.